Welcome everyone to the Minnesota Women in Public Finance Annual Conference virtual series. I'd like to introduce today's host, Kathy Cardell from the Hennepin County Office of Budget and Finance. Kathy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Cardell, and I'm a founding member and president of the Minnesota chapter of Women in Public Finance. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the first of a series of 3 virtual events that is taking the place of this year's 9th annual conference. Maybe not really taking the place of, I guess it really is going to be this year's 9th annual conference. Because of the pandemic, some of the Minnesota WPF's board work has been curtailed because we have not been able to hold the types of events that we usually do. We chose not to solicit sponsorships in 2020 because honestly, it didn't seem right given the circumstances, and we were lucky enough to have some funds left in our bank account from the generous support of many firms in 2019. As a result, we were still able to carry out our scholarship program in 2020 and awarded scholarships to 6 deserving young women that you will hear more about at our next event on November 19th. And we will be reaching out to request sponsorships for 2021 later this year. I hope you will consider supporting our organization. Our ask is small, only $500, and we are hopeful that we will be able to offer more content as well as scholarships next year. 2020 has been a strange and difficult year for most of us. While I'm sorry that we cannot gather together in person to learn and network, the Minnesota WPF board has assembled a series of topics and presenters that we hope speak to the times that we are living in. Today, Dr. Artika Tyner, the founding director of the Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, will discuss how women in public finance professions can be leaders in the workplace to make them more diverse, inclusive, and supportive. On Thursday, November 19th, Kirsten Delegard, the director and co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project, will describe the innovative methodologies used to illuminate how structural racism has shaped our urban landscape and blocked African Americans from critical avenues for housing stability and wealth accumulation. And finally, on Tuesday, December 1st, Chloe Baum and Shara Shermer of PFM Center for Justice and Safety will discuss how calls for local governments to re-examine the role of the criminal justice system and rethinking policing in unprecedented ways can be understood and evaluated in the context of policy, operations, and budgets. I sincerely hope you will consider registering for all 3 events. Now for a few housekeeping details. Each session will last approximately 1 hour, including time for questions. If you have a question, please post it in the Zoom chat function. You go to the chat box, you will see some instructions there. The moderator for each session will be monitoring and will attempt to have questions addressed, assuming that there is time. Following each session, we will randomly put all attendees into breakout rooms hosted by Minnesota WPF board members, where we can have a small group discussion or simply have the chance to see each other, say hello, and reconnect. For the first time, there will be a prize basket raffled off, again via a random draw, during each of the 3 sessions. The prize is 2 bottles of wine, 1 red and 1 white, and 2 very lovely Minnesota WPF logo wine glasses. The winner each day will be announced during the breakout sessions, and we will work with each winner to get the goodie basket safely delivered to you. If you are having any technical difficulties during any of the sessions and you cannot access the chat function on Zoom, you can email www.mnwpf.org for assistance. We'll be monitoring that site as well, and we'll do our best to help you out. And finally, many, many thanks to Dorsey and Whitney for providing the Zoom platform and all, and I mean all, of the technical assistance necessary to make these virtual events successful. I specifically want to call out Alyssa Meyer, Rima Murphy, and Shanice Walker. There is no way we could have done this without them. Now I'm delighted to turn this over to Rhonda Scobie, Vice President for Education on the Minnesota WPF Board and a partner at Dorsey and Whitney, who will introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Artika Tyner. Rhonda?
Thanks, Kathy. I am honored to introduce to you the first speaker in our 2020 Women in Public Finance webinar series, Dr. Artika Tyner. Dr. Tyner is passionate in her pursuit of justice. At the University of St. Thomas School of Law, Dr. Tyner serves as the founding director of the Center on Race, Leadership, and Social Justice, where she is committed to training students to create new inroads for freedom and justice. Her motto is planting people, growing justice, and Dr. Tyner is the founder of a nonprofit by that name that works to create social change by promoting literacy and diversity in children's books. She is also a prolific author whose works include The Leader's Journey, a guide to discovering the leader within, and The Lawyer as Leader. Her best-selling children's books include Justice Makes a Difference, the story of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire, Amazing Africa, A to Z, Kofi Loves Music, So You Want to Be a Supreme Court Justice, and Joey and Grandpa Johnson's Day in Rondo. Dr. Tyner earned her BA from Hamline University and her law degree from the University of St. Thomas. Subsequently, Dr. Tyner earned a Master of Public Policy and Leadership in order to gain tools for effecting social change through policy reform efforts. Later, inspired by the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, she obtained a doctorate in leadership. Dr. Tyner is committed to empowering others to lead within their respective spheres of influence. She provides leadership development and career coaching for professionals and has developed leadership educational materials for K-12 students, college and graduate students, faith communities, and nonprofits. We are honored to have Dr. Tyner with us here today to speak on leadership development and cultural competency and how women in public finance professions can serve as leaders in our workplace to make them more diverse, inclusive, and supportive. Thank you very much, Dr. Tyner, for joining us today. Dr. Tyner?
Thank you, and thank you for that warm welcome. I'm excited to be here with you today. When I heard about and learned more about your work of women in public finance, I know that you are helping to manifest and lead change in meaningful ways in our communities locally, nationally, and globally. So I just want to thank you for your work. My intention of being here with you today is to give you a little inspiration for the leadership journey and also just share some of the best practices, what's emerging related to research, and provide you with some practical tools on how to continue to build your leadership skills in a meaningful way. So when I think about this is a personal journey for me. When I began a study of leadership, first of all, I said, well, it's not about me. Leadership is about someone else. My goal, of course, is to be an efficient and effective attorney and an educator and serve in my local community. But leadership was really a title that I avoided. But my hope is for you today that you can think about it as an effective tool to bring forth meaningful change, not just professionally, but also personally in some meaningful ways. So what's in the journey ahead for us this afternoon is I'll do a bit of an introduction about my own leadership journey, and then also provide some of the latest data and best practices around leadership. And last but not least, profile some of the women leaders who have been very impactful, who could serve as a source of inspiration for your work. So when we think about this specifically, my background, I know you heard, and thank you for that introduction, this idea of who I am and what's my background. Anytime I think about a speaker, I want to know a little bit more about them. What inspires them? Why do they do their work? So for me, my dream, and you can see it from the picture here, was to become a superhero for justice. I wanted to become Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire. Instead of it was a bird, it was a plane. No, in fact, it was really going to be me. I wanted to become Wonder Woman with a law degree and an afro. I was determined to create a modern day and contemporary Justice League where I could use my professional training in meaningful ways to help strengthen my community. And why was that relevant to me as an attorney in particular? And when I think about it through the lens of leadership, because I believe that law is a language of power. So I was convinced if I could become more well-versed in that language as a professional, that I could be more impactful in my community. So when I think about this specifically in my training as a civil rights attorney, I've worked on a number of different education and criminal justice issues around policy reform. And specifically, as you heard in my introduction, relating it to racial justice and equity in some meaningful ways. So how does this tie into women and leadership? What started to emerge for me over the past couple of years is thinking specifically about finance and about economic development in some meaningful ways. And when I thought about it, and I mentioned that I am a civil rights attorney, there was one component of my work that I was missing. I was missing the component that was actually Dr. King's final campaign, the Poor People's Campaign. Although he did not live to see it, that campaign manifested in May of 1968. So here's a little bit of homework for you. Time magazine covered the piece around the Poor People's Campaign, and what it was also called was Resurrection City, because one of the things that Dr. King wanted to see was to make sure that the face of poverty was something that everyone could talk about, and how we can end poverty, how we can make justice and freedom for all really come alive in some meaningful ways. So another connection to a remarkable woman leader is Marian Wright Edelman, because she ended up being general counsel for the Poor People's Campaign. We know her today as the founder of the Children's Defense Fund, and we know that she's done great work to promote equity for women, for people of color, and especially to lift the voice of children. So when we think about this, and I'm going to start today to put it in the context of my work, as you're thinking about strategies on how you can be more effective as a woman leading change, here are some of the considerations. So putting it squarely in this idea and reality of civil rights. So here's one thing. First of all, we know based upon the research that women are more likely than men to underestimate their abilities. So what are some ways that you can really, and think about this throughout our conversation today, take inventory of what are your abilities and how can you leverage them in meaningful ways? It then leads to that women speak with less confidence about their accomplishments. I still struggle with that. Sitting here in 2020 in November, I struggled with this for my whole lifetime. But I've learned over the years, and here's one quick strategy that I share with my coaching clients. Maybe one way to do this is to even talk about yourself in the third person first before you share what those accomplishments are. Next, this is a piece that I continue to see when I did a lot of work in trying to increase diversity in hiring. Women tend only to apply for jobs when they meet all of the listed qualifications. I'm giving you a bit of a challenge today for that new leadership role, for that new experience that you may be looking for. If you don't meet all of the qualifications initially, highlight and really showcase the ones that you do and the ones that you're continuing to grow the skill set, to evolve into that best you, to be that leader. Don't let that always be the hindrance. At least get involved and at least try. This piece is from actually the League of Women Voters, and it definitely aligns on what you see of sentiments from women about running for public office, but for leadership more in generally, that women tend not to take on leadership roles unless they're asked or invited. So if you miss everything that I say today, please know I'm extending an invitation. Whatever that leadership role is that you feel called to do, you are now invited by Dr. Tyner to make sure that you pursue it in some meaningful ways. And here's the piece that surprises most people when I bring up the research about women and leadership. Most are not aware of the importance of negotiations related to salary. Now, in fact, most people shy away from it, and especially for women, based upon the data. And we know then that it's an average salary loss of at least about $1 million over the lifetime of a woman. So I would encourage you to think about how can you make sure that the salary that you receive aligns with the market, aligns with your male counterparts. And one of the things that I oftentimes tell people, if they're not sure what they can do for diversity and inclusion, two things I don't want you to miss. There are two things you can do immediately and have some influence over no matter what organization you're in. You can ensure and work to address whether or not your hiring policies are inclusive. And you might be thinking, Dr. Tyner, what do you mean by that? I can't tell you how many organizations that I've worked with directly that their default is to only do internal hires, only hire a friend or someone that you know. Let's make sure that we're clear and transparent with our hiring practices, and they're open and fair and balanced to any qualified candidate who applies. Next, everyone says, once again, I don't know what to do. Number two, pay parity. And why does this matter? Still yet today, where we're sitting in 2020, bridging into 2021, we are making little to none as far as our progress on pay parity of the same job, same pay, same work. Now, I know I have listed here, this particular statistic is looking at the comparison between white men and white women. So let's look at it more broadly. If current trends continue, women will not see equal pay until the year, and I'll allow you just to take a moment to ponder and guess. I would hope that it would be year 2020, but I had access to the data when I was appointed to Governor Dayton's Young Women's Initiative Council, and actually the year is 2059. So it gives us a sense that if we do not address inclusive hiring practices and recruitment and both promotion as well, and also pay parity, we have not addressed even the baseline issues impacting women and our ability to excel and move forward on the career ladder. So more specifically, since we're talking about diversity, I would be remiss not to share another layer of this reality, because the truth be told, for an African-American woman, and this is the research from Lean In, I would have to work until when to get pay parity with a white male in 2020. Based upon the research and the studies, I'd have to work until August 2021 for pay parity to come alive. For Latinas, it's all the way until November 2021. So when we think about this and we have conversations about wealth creation, about access, a part of this is about decision-making throughout the process within our organizations to make sure those principles we all love to talk about of equity and inclusion really come alive. So then I leave it to, if we know what some of these challenges are, what can be done? So one of the things that I'd have you think about, just take a moment, think about some of the words that come to mind when you think about leadership, whether it's in the context of how do you address some of those civil rights issues that I just talked about, or how do you address increasing diversity in women in finance and public finance? What strategies can you think about? Or even if it's about serving in the community or being able to do some new endeavors in your professional background, what are some of the ways that you would define leadership in a meaningful way? So just think about what some of those words are that come to mind. I'll tell you, typically I hear things about humility, about empathy, about teamwork, collaboration, having a clear vision. So there's some commonalities of some of the words that we get a chance to hear. So I would encourage you, if you don't mind, you can please feel free to leave a few of the answers that come to mind for you in the chat, and we can share and talk about those and see if there's some common themes. But here are a few that I'd just like to share with you as kind of the core themes that help to ground us in how to define leadership. So when we look at it specifically, the first one is related to vision. This one's from Oprah Winfrey. Whatever our dreams, ideas, or projects, we plant a seed, nurture it, and then reap the fruits of our labor. So this piece oftentimes, especially, and I'll make sure that we're talking specifically about one of the topics that was provided for in my introduction of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we can't say that we're committed to those things as values of our organization, as personal values, unless we have a clear vision of what that looks like. What does it look like to have a more inclusive workplace? What does it look like to have a more inclusive profession? So really identifying what those outputs are, help to give us a clearer sense of what the vision is and what can bring everyone together collectively to move forward to make that vision come alive. Also, this piece around social justice, and this is deeply rooted in those principles related to equity of how do we create the type of society where everyone can thrive and reach their full potential in meaningful ways. So this is a quote from Ida B. Wells. And if you don't know who Ida B. Wells is, let me do an introduction. Ida B. Wells was a journalist that focused on racial equity related issues and also issues related to women's rights. So she gives us a sense of what we need to do. This is kind of that speak up and speak out principle of the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And I know today we're looking at it initially through research and data, looking at policy and practice. So what are some ways that you can turn the light of truth on some of the things that you're seeing? And last but not least, it may be simplistic in the analysis, but I love this particular quote from the late Dr. Maya Angelou. She says, if you get, give, if you learn, teach. And one of my own personal commitments related to women in leadership and being as impactful as I can be has been truly this. Every time I receive knowledge, I give it to others for those emerging women leaders who are coming behind me. Every time I have an opportunity to learn something new about my practice area or about new areas emerging in the law, I naturally get an opportunity, since I'm a professor, to teach. So thinking about all these components as you bring them together, how does it manifest in a broader way for you individually and collectively? So when you think about it specifically, then it becomes, okay, if those are the philosophies that we're thinking about related to leadership, what skills do we need to be an effective leader? So looking at the research, you get a sense of it starts with that far corner of the pie, that collective vision again. So I would even encourage you as your chapter to identify what are your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, whether it's related to increasing diversity of your membership, if it's related to increasing the diversity in your profession, working with more diverse communities, whatever it may be, outline what that vision is. And then take the strategic action to go through the process of planning on how to reach those goals. So for instance, when I think about it specifically, I like to talk about it when I'm coaching folks or working with organizations to put some tangible measure on it. Within X number of years, I will do Y. Within X number of years, I will accomplish Z. And then bring together, because then it seems like it's just impossible. How do we accomplish some of these goals? And then we get stuck. So we don't make it all the way throughout this piece of bringing leadership together. Critical thinking. What are the other possibilities? Who are the folks that need to be in the room? Who can share expertise? How do you build momentum behind the work? So it's looking more at the strategy. And then what we also see here that's very important in the emerging leadership work is the power of influence. How do you use your influence in meaningful ways? Now you see it. I mean, the big one that we're seeing locally, and it'll come up again before the end of this month, we'll see that it's, for instance, buy local. American Express has brought in this idea of supporting small businesses. How can you use your influence in meaningful ways? I know that's one example related to dollars and cents again, but how do you use your influence, use your voice to manifest change in your organizations and your profession? And that leads to the final piece of really modeling the way. How do we make this come alive? It's one thing to see it written on paper, and it's another thing to take some strategic action ourselves to make everything that we're espousing a real reality. So when we look at what we know as well about leadership, we know that it's rooted in values and ethics. So I encourage you to outline those. When I work, whether it's our work in our nonprofit or in the classroom, one of the early things that I work on is identify what are our core values. How do we align in that way? What helps to bring us together? And it helps also for us to think about how do we manifest if we're talking about change, if we're talking about equity, if we count it as a value, it's significant and it's a part of then everything that we do. Last but not least, I want to encourage you to think about this particular piece, especially as women leaders, that leadership is unique as your DNA. It was one of the things that as I was doing my dissertation research that really emerged as a common theme, that my leadership style may not be the same as your leadership style. But the reality of it is we could have and work through some of the same characteristics, but a part of what you have to do is own your leadership strengths. And why is that important? And if you have not taken it, I highly recommend taking a Strengths Finder assessment. It's in the book, Now Discover Your Strengths by Buckingham and Clifton. Critically important because it helps you to identify that leadership DNA. You end up with identifying your top 5 leadership strengths. And so typically when I talk about this, I open it up to a broader conversation and have people kind of give me a sense of what they think my strengths are, that they've known me for a few minutes. How would you identify them? Now, most people guess them right. They get a sense that first, my top strength is that I'm relational. I enjoy working with people. I enjoy working with teams. Hence why I describe my work connecting directly to the community. You also, most people notice, they said, well, you're not using notes, you're just sharing information. Input is very high for me. So if you need to call that friend for a lifeline on your next game show night, call me, input. I'm studying everything from geography to economics, kind of eclectic in the way that I bring in information and analyze it. So input's very high. And then last but not least, I'll give you another one of my top 5 strengths is learner. So I'm very active in always learning something new, hence teaching something new. So you get a glimpse of if I could cultivate all of those things, not just personally, but professionally, I'm really making my leadership DNA come alive in some meaningful ways. Now, unfortunately, here's the reality. Despite me talking about it in such a positive way, based upon the research that associated with Gallup on how people are using their strengths in the workplace, there's something alarming that we're seeing. We're seeing based upon the research that there's millions of people accounted for around the world, that only 20% of people are using their strengths in their day-to-day work. I'll say it again, just to make sure we're taking this in. Only 20% of people are using their strengths in their day-to-day work. What does it mean for us as leaders? What does it mean for us who are helping to organize and manage teams? It means that oftentimes, if we're not cognizant of it, and if we're not bringing together folks in some meaningful ways, that people aren't bringing their full potential to work. And I don't know about you. Yes, most people say, well, that's a missed opportunity, and they're looking at it in economic terms. I'm looking at it more broadly. That's a missed opportunity for innovation, for creativity, and to bring a team together. So make sure that you're thinking about this. What's the leadership DNA of each person that you're working with? How do you tap into it? And how do you bring those strengths together in meaningful ways? So when we look at this, it's tempting then to say leadership is about a person. It's about their position. It's about their title. It's about hierarchy of power. So you have the one person standing strong. I am the leader. But the reality of it is, and this is from my research, my scholarly research on this, goes back to that quote from Ida B. Wells. Goes back to that quote from Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Maya Angelou. It's a sense that leadership is far more than position, title, or about power. It's about vision. It's about impact. And it's about legacy as well. So I hope you're thinking about it. I was just on a call earlier today, and the main premise that I continue to talk about is the challenge that I foresee that many women face in the workplace is the challenge of thinking about succession planning. Who's coming after you? And it also becomes a challenge, and I've challenged many organizations to think about this as well. As women move up the ladder into other leadership roles, who are they going to not replace, but whose role will they learn more about to take on a new role for the future? So who is developing a succession plan that would be more inclusive for future women leaders as well? So that then begs the question that I would have for each of you: who's mentoring you? Who's coaching you? And who's serving? We don't talk about this frequently enough. Who's also serving as your sponsor? That person behind the scenes that's promoting you and talking about the value of your work. Because remember, I said, as women, we don't tend to talk about our accomplishments, but who are those sponsors that are out there saying, well, Dr. Tyner's research is making a difference. Oh, Dr. Tyner could take on that new leadership role or that new assignment. So make sure that as you're framing up this idea of how can you be more effective as a leader, that you're thinking about who are those mentors, who is your coach, and that may be even a professional coach that you work with to help you cultivate those strengths in some meaningful ways. And also, who are those sponsors who could help support and champion your work? So oftentimes it then becomes a debate that still yet folks are not convinced that maybe leadership's not for me, because are leaders born or are they made? So originally, when you're thinking about that leadership canon, where this idea of leadership studies comes from the idea of that maybe there's just a few great men or a few great people that just inherently through their DNA have these leadership skills. But I would challenge you to look at the contemporary research that helps to recognize finally that we represent half the sky. So in that way, that we can't be excluded from this idea of a few great people having these leadership skills of traditionally being defined as male military leaders. But the reality of it is, and I'll share some of the profiles throughout our time together today of women who have continued to lead change in some meaningful ways. So this idea of just only being born as a leader, being something that's exclusionary versus something that's more inclusive on how can we develop those core competencies that I've already talked about that enhance our leadership skills in some meaningful ways. So what are the hot topics? What are the trends? What do women leaders need to know? Now, I have this particular picture because it always brings me joy when I see it. This is me and my experience teaching and working at CIAS International University. And what I loved about this experience, I was teaching in the World Academy for the Future of Women. What I loved about this particular experience was the enthusiasm for young women to take on new leadership roles and be impactful. Why is that relevant as trends in leadership? Because a part of what we've not acknowledged over time, and you're starting to see finally, this is a part of a research question of what are the unique leadership characteristics of women. Now, in fact, there is a particular piece, and I'll read just a couple excerpts from it. It's a book that I'd recommend taking a look at as well. It's John Gerzima's book, Athena Doctrine. And he analyzes what are those core skills or competencies that people look for in leaders. And notice what the top three are. And I bet you're probably strong on all three of them. Being intuitive, being flexible, and empathetic. And why does he bring it up? Because he says 2/3 of people think the world would be a better place if men thought more like women in those three key areas of being intuitive, flexible, and also being empathetic. Let's take it into a little more data around what's happening related to leadership. And once again, I would highly recommend, I'm given a lot of potential homework assignments. Forgive me, that's the teacher in me. But I would recommend, this is a recent publication. It's called Leadership U, like the letter, Accelerating Through the Crisis Curve. So one of the things that I'd like to highlight from this particular book, and here's the front cover of it, it is written by the founder of Korn Ferry. And so you get a clear sense of how do we lead in the challenging times that we're in right now, where we are right now in 2020, and thinking about the novel global pandemic, shifts in the economy. What do we need to think about as leaders? Now, notice how you'll start to see some of the alignment around those being intuitive, being flexible, and having empathy. Notice what you'll see here. So it's outlined in the introduction of the book. It's based upon 69 million assessments of executives. The best in the class, who are amongst the top 20%, have 4 distinguishing qualities. So I hope you get a chance to think about how these qualities manifest in your life. So the first 3, notice this word's going to come up again, and this is a piece of naturally what women tend to have is one of those strengths that we'll grab a hold of. It's related to being intuitive. So here are the first 3. It talks about number 1, sets vision and strategy. Number 2, drives growth. And that's not just growth monetarily again. This is growth in individuals. How do you help to plant and water and help to see someone else bloom? What are your strategies? And then also this piece displays financial acumen. So you know some of the trends, things are changing in finance and the future of the economy. And then here's the 4th. So remember I said that there were 4. So the first one is sets vision and strategy. The second one is drives growth. The third one is displays financial acumen. And the 4th one is managing a crisis, which is too often underappreciated and overlooked until a crisis occurs. So I hope that you think about as those skills, you may have seen them, may have manifested them in other ways beyond just the workplace. I always tell everyone, the best CEO that I ever seen was my mother. She took nothing, made it something, and multiplied it, and was able to stretch it not just for herself, but for 3 children. And then also her financial acumen of being able to, once again, be able to balance a budget monthly, being able to manage a household like a CEO experience, thinking about our inputs, our outputs, thinking about how we'll produce outcomes as it relates to even education. So she brought all those pieces together constantly. So how are you leveraging and manifesting your leadership skills? And what are those skills that you just don't think about as core leadership qualities, but that you use all the time? So as you're thinking about these trends, of course, inclusion is a key one. As we think about where I sit right now, I'm in my office in St. Paul, Minnesota. We know that as of 2020, St. Paul, Minnesota was declared a majority minority city. Many projected that we wouldn't see those types of trends. Initially, when I started my research, we'd say 2060, then we start saying 2050. And now where we sit today, we know that America will no longer have an ethnic majority by year 2043. We know that as of today, where we sit, the vast majority of new births are related to children of color. We also know, as we look at the fastest growing economy, those mega cities, they're not just in the US, they're across what we either call the global South, but I think more importantly, saying across the world in some meaningful ways. The fastest pace of growth, of innovation and population growth is happening where? Not in a country, but in the continent of Africa. And I also just want to be remiss if I didn't give us a sense that America has held a position for quite some time as the third most populous nation in the world, as far as countries, of course. And who will take us out of that spot? It's already happened. I'll give you a hint: West Africa, Nigeria. So when you think about this, you see that the world is changing rapidly, of global perspectives, of inclusion becoming not optional anymore, really becoming of necessity. So will you be adaptable? Will you be able to embrace innovation? Will you collaborate? And will you be able to communicate the future in a way that people can resonate with and that's meaningful? So when we look at this, if we think about trends in leadership, it's really about you and I and how we help to build strategic plans that are about building together and cultivating innovation and bringing together people to help create and fuel that innovation. So I hope that you can just take this moment from this slide to know that maybe it's that kind of Bob Dylan moment, that times are changing in some meaningful ways. And I think instead of stepping back and just saying, okay, what's happening? Let's lean in literally and maximize our opportunities to learn and grow. So for me, I manifest this not only just in my work with professionals like yourself, but also in challenging young people, because my goal is to be able to inspire the next generation to already embrace inclusion, to already think about living in a globalized world and what does that really mean. So when I talk about this, I invite young people, but I also invite, of course, adults as well, like yourself, to join me in embarking on this leadership journey of learning. And that's not just a destination, because sometimes we get excited and we're like, we went to that one training program with Dr. Tyner, check the box, we are well on our way. No, my friends, this is a daily commitment to how we can be stronger leaders in meaningful ways. So when I think about this, and this particular picture means a lot to me, this is of my grandmother. She was an inspiration for my leadership and the work that I do today. She was one of the greatest leaders that I ever knew, because the reality was that she didn't wait for someone to give her a position. She didn't wait for someone to give her a title. In fact, most of us would probably have walked right past her. She would become probably one of those invisible workers because she was working in the service industry as a domestic. So in most instances, she would never be noticed by anyone. But I like to say my grandmother worked miracles. When she saw someone in need, she helped to address their need. When she saw the opportunity, whether it was homelessness or hunger, she fought against it in some meaningful ways, in some tangible ways, and made a difference. So when we think about this, what do you need to be effective as a woman who's leading change, as a woman who's helping to transform systems, who's a part of now the civil rights movement with me, who's a part of helping to make inclusion come alive? That you think about those ways on how can you serve? How can you have a sense of agency? How can you make sure that you're listening, not just beyond hearing, but you're listening and you're in tune to some of the social challenges that our world faces right now, that you're willing to collaborate with others in some strategic ways to help solve problems and to inspire others. That's why I talked about it's important to have a mentor, but I also hope that you are being a mentor to someone else in some meaningful ways. So how do you do this? It sounds like a lot. I've covered a lot of ground on what is leadership, how do we activate it, how does it come alive? Now I want to transition us into what strategies can you use to start leading change? So I have them as, building and establishing those partnerships, setting an agenda. And then the last piece, as a bit of an inspiration as well, is how do you unleash your moral imagination? How do we create the future right now? So I just want to go through these just briefly, and by introduction, have a chance to share about some people who have inspired me in some meaningful ways. So the first one is related to none other than Yantiwa. And the reason why I bring up Yantiwa is because the reality of it was they were in the midst of, and this is in the Ashanti Kingdom, so this is in Ghana, in the midst of a bit of a battle with the British about land, about access. And so one of the challenges was who would help to protect the golden stool. And the golden stool, if you don't have any background, represents power and the authority. You see it in the top right-hand corner behind Yantiwa. So that represents nationhood. And so she gave a very powerful response. She said, I must say this, if you, the men of the Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. So why do I bring this up? Because she had to cultivate the type of vision in other women to say, okay, if the men won't join us, and oftentimes we don't talk about this. Remember, I talked about those examples of a few great men and potentially being those great war heroes. We don't oftentimes hear about a woman as a great hero that was willing to take a stand when no one else would, and had a vision not for herself and where she stood presently, but a vision for the future, that she would be willing to fight to keep the kingdom, to be able to protect it from any type of challenges that would displace the people or harm the people. So she was willing to take a stand. So the question that I have for you today is, once again, what is that vision? What are you willing to take a stand for? What will you say will be your legacy and impactful around your work in public finance? What will you do? Next, I have Yantiwa, and after her, we have Dr. Wangari Maathai. So we got the vision, and then now we're going to talk about the importance of establishing partnerships. So Dr. Maathai is an excellent example that you cannot do this work alone. If we're going to do real meaningful work, we have to do it collectively. So she gives us a sense of, she's the creator of what we know today of the Green Belt movement. And she reminds us that until you dig a hole, you plant a tree, you water, and you make it survive, you haven't done a thing. You're just talking. So why do I bring this up? With the Green Belt movement, Dr. Wangari Maathai started with planting just one tree. The Green Belt movement, as of today, has planted over 50 million trees. Why is this significant? It's important because oftentimes we think about change, we think about manifesting our work, we think about the future of our careers, and we think about this all in the capacity of one, in isolation. But I challenge you to think about what are those strategic partnerships that you can use to help build in some meaningful ways and manifest change. So whether it's establishing, and one of the things that I'm going to launch just personally in 2021 is a mentorship circle, because I want to make sure those emerging women leaders who are coming after me have the tools and the lessons that I wish that I had learned without many of the challenges manifesting, and then you learn them. I want them to learn and be equipped first. So one of the things that I'm going to do is establish those peer-to-peer mentorship relationships among other young professionals, and then also bring in some of those folks that might be more seasoned in their skill set to help offer additional support to establish the partnerships of having and sharing information collectively. Next, set an agenda. This is from Shirley Chisholm. And if you don't know who Shirley Chisholm is, I'm very pleased to do an introduction, because Shirley Chisholm is often not talked about in American history, but Shirley Chisholm played a significant role. And as women, we'd be remiss if we don't know her name and her legacy. So who is Shirley Chisholm? She described herself as being unbought and unbossed. She talked about being the candidate of the people. So in the 1970s, she dared to do something that was pretty much most folks probably would have said unheard of. She dared to run for this nation's highest office, which she ran for President of the United States. And so when you think about setting an agenda, I want you to think about strategically, what are those agendas as it relates to key leadership roles? So she was able to position herself to run as the first African-American female candidate on a major party ticket. So she helped open the doors for many of the women today that we see who are running for office in meaningful ways. So how does this connect? What should we be thinking about? When you have clarity of vision, that's that piece from Yantiwa. Once you establish some of those strategic and essential partnerships, what is the agenda that you're going to set? How do you help to manifest what the outcomes are of what you're doing? How do you measure success? Where are you headed? Where are you going? And as a result of your work as a woman leader, what's the change that's manifested for the women who come after you? So this is the piece that you think about as far as strategic action, strategic planning. Now, I look at this because I also earned a master's in public policy. So I think about it in the policy development realm. I'm thinking about, how do we make sure if these political streams come together, if this problem stream, if this policy stream, if all these pieces come together, basically meaning setting fertile ground for change, do we have a clear agenda on what that change would look like? Do we have clear solutions on how we create new pathways for women in leadership? How do we have new solutions on how do we bring more women into public finance? How do we help to train younger women, K through 12? What's the agenda? And how do you set and position yourself to have solutions for some of the practical problems that society faces today? So I talk about it, and based upon my leadership theory, it's about planting people, growing justice, the real manifestation. And that's why I'm here today, on how do you inspire others to ask that key question of what's in your hands to make a difference in the world? And how do we bring it together in meaningful ways to manifest change on a larger scale? So when I think about it, I talked about it already in the sense of how you set this agenda, but it first starts with addressing what a need is. So my challenge even for you today is to think about, as you're going through, and I read about the exciting lineup of other speakers that you'll have, what is the need? What are you seeking to address through your programmatic pieces, through the work and vision of your chapter? What is it? And then asking those key questions about what does it look like if we achieve this overall goal? How do we align with other partners? Because this isn't just about one dimension or one profession. These issues that are impacting women on our trajectory into leadership roles are widespread. So how can we connect it across other professional lines that have been established, but be more fluid on how do we create leadership roles in meaningful ways? And the last piece I'm going to talk about now is this piece of unleashing your moral imagination. Because I know the reality, if I was sitting in your shoes, I would say, Dr. Tyner, all these things sound great. It's beautiful that you have the luxury to research, work with students, create mentorship circles, and do all these things. The reality of it is, for most people, maybe that you're just simply tired. It may be that you may be feeling overwhelmed. Maybe in light of all the circumstances that we're talking about today and the things that we're facing, you may be feeling anxious. But I will give you this challenge, and this is personally what one of my mentors challenged me to do, is begging the question of what would Harriet do? And this is Harriet as in Harriet Tubman, who is also called Moses, who helped to lead what we know today as the Underground Railroad. But we also are starting to get more information about Harriet as well, that she also was one of the spies or intelligence agents around the Civil War. So she played a key role in helping to end today what we know is slavery. So when we think about what would Harriet do, it gave me a little motivation around the work and what I was doing in some meaningful ways. There will be challenges to be an advocate to bring forth equity for all. There will be obstacles to make sure that women have things like pay parity and that there's fairness in the hiring process. There will be trials, there will be tests. It all won't tie together professionally or even personally. But this piece and why I bring this slide is a reminder that despite all of those things, the real challenge is how do we keep going one day and one step at a time to help work towards making diversity, equity, and inclusion come alive in some meaningful ways. So I use this as just kind of the encouragement piece, to the motivation. It's wonderful to hear about the other women who have led change, but I don't think you can do this without having a clear vision as well, that in unleashing your moral imagination, it's the possibility that Harriet Tubman or Moses, she knew that she wouldn't be able to live to see us today where we're sitting having this conversation, that she wouldn't be here to be able to see a woman run for national office. She wouldn't be here to see women in great career paths, but that she could help to set the course. So when I'm talking about unleashing your moral imagination, I'm challenging you to think ahead to the future on how you can create new pathways for those who are coming after you to have meaningful opportunities to learn, grow, and flourish. So last but not least, this is some of the more direct pieces that I like to share with you about leadership development. So if you were sitting here with me and we were having a coaching session, this is what I'd be talking about. First, about the inner work, putting you square and center. And unfortunately, for as many women clients that I have helped to coach to success, oftentimes the one person that they never talk about is themselves, and how to nourish themselves and how to reach their career goals and dreams. I challenge you to write your own vision statement. What's your vision for your career? What's your personal mission statement? We can quote these things for our organizations, but what does it mean for you individually? Next, I already talked about this. I think it's being very specific about what are your strengths. And once you identify them, think about how you leverage them in meaningful ways, because that leads you for the opportunity to create your own real signature brand in some meaningful ways. How do you help to show what and how you bring value, no matter where you are? But you first have to know what those skill sets are. Last but not least, and I'm going to take this through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion in some meaningful ways. And let's just break down those terms just for a moment, because they're used quite a bit, but I encourage you to outline what they mean to you and what they mean collectively for your group. Now, we know diversity tends to focus more on representation, bringing more women to the table, for instance. Equity is about the experience on what it looks like when everyone's brought to the table in meaningful ways. It shapes our policies. It shapes our practices. While inclusion is the real manifestation of it, to be able to see it come alive, not just a feeling, but as around a core value, around a way that we come together and the way that we stay together and build bridges collectively. So a part of this is connect with others to build some of these strong partnerships. And this is a unique opportunity. Maybe there are other opportunities to connect with other groups that focus it on inclusion in some meaningful ways. How can you work with them in creating core policies, creating systems, creating and sharing ideas, building new pipelines into your career and your profession? And so I encourage you to kind of outline who those potential partners could be and start building those bridges today. And last but not least, a part of this is about collective engagement. So how do we build the people power, the collective engagement that we need to make inclusion come alive in some meaningful ways? So I will pause here. That way we can open it up for some questions and engage more as we go through the rest of the presentation.